Hey everyone, and welcome back to another video. This time I'm just going to be talking about kind of raiding, what's hardcore, what's difficult, and all these various different ideas. And the reason why I've decided to do this topic is that Watcher recently made a blog, like a post, one of their dev water coolers, in which he just talked about some of the raid philosophies in classic Warcraft, the Burning Crusade, and then in Wrath. And it was a pretty interesting read. It's all stuff that I kind of knew because I played in BC and Wrath. But it kind of brings up some talking points, really. And I think the first thing we need to do is define what's hardcore and what's difficult. Well, I'd say that what's difficult is that kind of the 10-minute span of a fight. How hard is a specific fight at one simple encounter, or not simple encounter, but just one encounter? How much difficulty is there crammed into that little period of time? I think that's probably the measure of difficulty that most people would care about the most. Of course, you could definitely make the argument that having to spend weeks and whatever gearing up for something is difficult, but I think that's more a measure of time spent, and I think that really what hardcore is kind of, yes, it is related to difficulty, but it's also more related to time when you think about it. Back in the day in vanilla World of Warcraft, fight mechanics were they were a bit simple. Well, they weren't very simple, but they were far more rudimentary than some of the more modern mechanics that we have these days. Yet people still consider it to be the pinnacle of, well, not the pinnacle, but sort of a high point in hardcore raiding. And that's something that's, I think, a little bit problematic, because people kind of want to go back to that vanilla stage in terms of bosses and things like that, but I think we do have bosses that are far better these days, and the reason why vanilla was so hardcore is because you had to manage 40 people. You got loot, not as fast, and the whole progression paths just weren't really as fleshed out, but what it meant is that how hardcore you are, that's really just a measure of time, how much time you had to spend. You were doing content which was not extremely hard, but did have a high requirement in terms of the barrier to entry, which was locked off by the amount of time that you had to spend. That's why classic World of Warcraft was kind of hardcore in so many ways, but difficult? I mean, yeah, it was difficult, but I don't think it would be anywhere, it wouldn't be as difficult to say some of the modern, really complex boss mechanics that we have. And I've actually got a lot of people which would back up my assertion. A lot of the hardcore raiders, the really, top people like Method and Blood Legion and Vodka and Midwinter, a lot of these guys have said that, yeah, boss fights are far harder than they ever have been. And really the reason why they're able to clear raids and that kind of thing so quickly these days is because once a new raid tier comes out, you just jump right in and you get to the bosses, and it wasn't really like that as much in classic Warcraft and some of those other periods that people have talked about. So I think that really fights have got harder as we went on, it's just that they've also got more accessible. But let's just talk about the various expansions from vanilla all the way up to Mists of Pandaria. Then I'm going to talk about how difficult I think, or how the balance should be between the difficulty of fights and then the logistical difficulty, or what I'd call being hardcore in a way in terms of the time you need to spend. And then I'll talk about how independent raid tiers should be, because one of the major things which added to the time requirement of vanilla and the Burning Crusade was the lack of raid tier independence. One pretty much led on from the other. So yeah, first of all, let's talk about vanilla. So vanilla World of Warcraft came out in November 2004, and then 2 months later, a bunch of people killed Luciferon, who's the first boss in Molten Core, and it started off with just Onyxia and Molten Core being the things. Now, to get into Molten Core, well, first of all, you had to get to level 60. That took months. I suppose it would have taken months if you're being a little bit slow, maybe a month or a month and a half, something if you're trying pretty hard. It was definitely a lot slower than it was these days, or than it is these days. So, getting to Luciferon, yeah, it wasn't that hard, but it took a lot of time. You needed to farm things in, like, Ubers and Stratholme or Skullmance, whatever, and that took a lot of time. And then when the new raid tiers came out, like the Temple of Ahn'Qiraj, Blackwing Lair, I know they're not in the right order, and then Naxxramas, what happened is that the difficulty of those fights and those bosses and the tuning was done based on the previous tier's level of gear. And because in these 40-person raids, the amount of loot that dropped per player was actually significantly less than it is in raids these days, it took a very long time for people to gear up. An extremely long time, actually. And it wasn't that the fights were mechanically extremely complex, it's just that you had to grind them a lot to get everyone geared up so that you could move on to the next tier. And one of the things which just makes people think that, oh, Naxxramas Raiders are clearly the most hardcore, doing the hardest content. I'd argue because it just took so much time to get to Nax. Oh, you're totally hardcore. Absolutely, without a doubt. But in terms of the difficulty, I mean, yeah, there were some complex and difficult fights in there, but I think sometimes people give it a little bit more credit than it deserves. You know, rose-tinted spectacles and all that. But in vanilla, they did do one thing, which I think was rather important, and that was Zul'Gurub, and this is something that Ian Hazzikostas, who was Watcher who wrote the blog, and something he said is that they tried out Zul'Gurub and the Ruins of Ahn'Qiraj, and what these did was they allowed people to kind of gear up into the other raids a little bit easier, but also it added raid difficulties in which gave more individual responsibility to the raiders who were actually in the raid, because in a 40-person group, if you're just one of 20, 30 DPS, whatever, you're just one of a tiny, tiny machine. You know, you don't really feel as much there. So my summary of vanilla is that it was definitely the most hardcore because it had the highest time commitment. Was it the hardest? I don't believe so. But it was definitely the most hardcore. And I think any difficulty, not any, but most of the difficulty that it would have had is due to the rate of acquisition of gear, and how, I guess, to really progress through bosses faster, guilds probably had to do some fights when they didn't have as much gear because of the way the loot drops worked back in the day. So then we move on to the Burning Crusade. Now, the Burning Crusade was a bit more accessible, I believe. Yeah, they had achievements and all that, but it was still more accessible. You know, you start off, you've got, well, the main raids, of course, were 25 player in the Burning Crusade. Essentially, they just realized from vanilla and the Ruins of AQ and Zul'Gurub is that in around 20 to 25 is a really nice number. And it certainly is, actually. And there's that right balance of an epic scale, but also enough people, or the right amount of people, so that everyone feels special. Everyone kind of feels like a unique snowflake who's helping out, which is great. But what Burning Crusade did is it sort of continued on the trend of one raid leading to another, with not much crossover, because you really did need the gear from one raid tier to move on to the next. There wasn't really as much of a catch-up mechanic. I mean, sure, Badges of Justice were there, but they only really came into the fore with the Sunwell patch. And speaking of the Sunwell patch, well, the Sunwell came in, and the Sunwell itself, it took a great deal of time to get there. You had to progress your way all the way through BT, Hyjal, and the other places which I'm totally forgetting in a wave of derbiness, but it took a long time to get there, a very long time. So that was a little bit problematic, and it meant that not a great deal of people actually saw the Sunwell, which is a pity, because the times I've went back there, I've really found it to be quite enjoyable. Yes, so once again, it's this idea of kind of hardcore being to do with a lot of time being spent, honestly. But what they did do in the Sunwell patch is they made it so that Badges of Justice could actually buy gear that were, in some cases, actually comparable to the gear that you get off Black Temple and places like that. So that really helped to get people into raiding, and it helped out with accessibility. Another thing in the expansion, of course, which helped out a lot with accessibility, and I think is one of the defining raids of World of Warcraft because of what it's done to the game, is Karazhan. It was a 10-player raid. That meant that your smaller guilds, your friends and family, and that kind of thing, were able to go in and get some raiding done, which is pretty damn cool. So overall, I think the Burning Crusade, at its end, definitely a lot less hardcore than, or not a lot less, a good bit less hardcore than vanilla, just because of the way those badges allowed you to get gear and various other things like that. But you know what? It was still a pretty hardcore expansion in terms of, if you kill Jaden, then damn, props. You put in the time, you put in the effort, you put in the work and the skill, and that's awesome. But I think for designing an MMO, it's an interesting idea about the raid tiers being in such a ladder. And you may think that I'm going to come out at the very end of this video in complete defense of the Pandaria way of doing things. I'm not, and listen on, because I think that there's a happy medium between the BC way and the Mists of Pandaria way. Okay, so next, Wrath of the Lich King, my personal favourite expansion. I know that a lot of people would contend with my assertion there, but basically, I really enjoyed Ulduar, and I didn't raid Trial of the Crusader in a hardcore manner. Our guild just cleared it once a week, and that was it. And because of the way I was tackling that content, it was very enjoyable to me. And then ICC is flat out just one of my favorite raid instances. I love it. I love the story, the fights, the lore, everything. I think it was so well just paced. But I really actually also think that a lot more mechanical complexity entered some fights in Wrath of the Lich King, and this would keep on, continuing to escalate in Cataclysm. But that increase in difficulty was pretty cool. And not the Burning Crusade, Wrath of the Lich King is really where Blizzard set up a lot of the norms that we know today, or at least it's where they started kind of molding the raid structure into the one that we know. So it starts off things like Naxxramas are available in a 10 and a 25 player mode, so that it's accessible to more people. But of course the way they did it is that 10 didn't give you as good gear as 25, and that was the model for the expansion pretty much. And I think that was an interesting model because the more logistically hard way of doing things did give you better loot. And I can definitely say that personally, I did more raids that were a 10, but I also did more 25s comparatively than I do now, because it's something that would definitely be forming on a server, and guilds would sometimes get together and run 25s for the better loot and that kind of thing. But in terms of how hardcore Wrath of the Lich King was, it wasn't as hardcore as the last two. It didn't take you as much time to gear up, because even from the get-go on the expansion, you could get some pretty nice epics from, well, not pretty nice, you get some half-decent epics from your heroic dungeons. And then also because Naxxramas 10 was very accessible, you could get in there and get some nice gear pretty easily as well. And that really set people up quite decently for Ulduar. And that meant that Ulduar, it didn't have such a logistical and sort of time component into actually getting into Ulduar. Okay, it would still take you more time gearing than, say, a Pandaria raid would, but it was a lot more accessible in that regard than the equivalent sort of raids in Vanilla and Burning Crusade. And I think that was a good thing. It meant that quite a few people got to see Ulduar. The problem is, of course, that Ulduar was only out for 5 months before they replaced it with Trial of the Bloody Crusader, which was, as much as I enjoyed TOC, it was nowhere near as good as Ulduar, not even the same league. But in terms of the whole hardcore balance, we also got the whole emblems of Justice and Frost and all that coming in this expansion, and that expanded upon the Badges of Justice system that we saw at the very end of the Sunwell, which really gave you a catch-up mechanic there. And that catch-up mechanic meant that you were definitely able to get yourself into raiding in a more easy fashion, and I remember the 2 times that I capped characters in Wrath of the Lich King and then decided to go ahead and play them. I really enjoyed that loot acquisition phase because it lasted a little bit. So that was interesting. Though one thing that I suppose is a bit of a problem is that you kind of didn't need to go into Ulduar if you were raiding TOC. You could just do your heroics, do that kind of thing, get your gear from Sarth, who was also a great source of gear, by the way, and the Eye of Eternity, and then just use your Justice points, or whatever the hell it was called back then, to get some other half-decent gear. So that was maybe a little bit of a criticism. But of course, going into Ulduar was still something that was worth a lot more than, say, going into Throne of Thunder normal would be today. In my opinion, anyway. At least it seems like that's how it's shaped out. Then, of course, Raid Finder comes in. Not the Raid Finder, the Dungeon Finder comes in, which really, again, helps with accessibility. But I think that the actual core content there, things like fights, I know, Algalon, your man with the many, the mouth dude, Yogg-Saron, Arthas, I think they were all mechanically pretty hard fights. Professor Preacherside, I think that's how you pronounce it. Yeah, I remember a lot of people having troubles with him, and he was a fun fight too. But there was a lot of stuff going on there. The fights got more difficult, but they also got more accessible, and that's something that a lot of guilds will say as well. The whole idea of, Garrosh being killed after a few days or whatever, meaning that Garrosh is somehow easier, I'm not really particularly sure if I'd agree with that, because I think that if you were to throw a Garrosh-style fight back at the vanilla crowd, sure, because they were intelligent people who put a lot of time in, they'd get it, but I think they'd find it to be some of the hardest fights they've ever done, if you get my drift. So that's what kind of went on in Wrath. Wrath is really when raiding, I think, hit the masses. And the main reason for that is, of course, the 10-player difficulty and how it was easier than 25. I know my guild raided a lot of 10s, mainly 10s actually, and I loved it. That's how I got into raiding. and this 10-player mode, I think, is just one of the... What it caused, especially in ICC with ICC 10, was just one of the best things for Wrath of the Lich King, and personally, it was my favorite period of raiding ever. More so than any of the current stuff, more so than anything in Cataclysm. I just liked the whole ICC 10 thing, I thought that was great. So yeah, very good. And that's Wrath talked about. Now if we just talk about some of the other ones, you know, Cataclysm, unfortunately they changed it up so the 10 and 25 gave you the same quality of loot, but that meant that they made 10 harder, which killed the accessibility issues. And then, of course, one of the gameplay aspects of Wrath is that you could gear up in 10, then move up into 25. You couldn't really do that anymore in Cataclysm because you still got the same loot, and that's a little bit of a pity. And then it just cut out gameplay for the 10-player crowd. But really, the raid system just continued. It was very easy to gear up because, you know, with Justice Points and stuff like that, the previous raid was just kind of nullified when a new patch came in. And then with Pandaria, you know, that system just kind of continued. But, of course, now we have flexible difficulty. And flexible, in my opinion, is one of the best things, just one of the best things that has happened to Warcraft. My guild still raids normals, yes, but I think that flex is great. I don't think there's any real downside to it, so absolutely bloody fantastic. Flex, you just help so much. And then, of course, LFR was added in the final patch of Cataclysm, then was more expanded upon during Mists. And what LFR basically does is it nullifies the entire previous raid tier, in that Siege of Orgrimmar LFR gear is better than Throne of Thunder normal gear. I'm not particularly sure if I think that's the right idea, but that's essentially a bit of a TLDR mixed in with some of my thoughts of what's really happened to raiding the last while. So let's get back to my two questions. And they were, how difficult should things be in terms of fights, and how difficult should it be in terms of logistics? So we'll be talking about difficulty in terms of how hard it is it to kill a boss during the period of time in which you are fighting it, so you know, that 15-minute window. And then, how hardcore does it have to be? How much time do you have to put in? And what do I think the right balance is? So, honestly, I think that right now, fights are getting relatively complex. I think that if they start making fights that are too much more complex, then it's just going to be a little bit of a headache. I think it's great that we have some really mechanically complex and highly difficult bosses at the minute, and just in terms of their, well, you know, complexity. That's great. But sometimes I just worry that they may end up overstepping that bound just a little bit in the future, and they'd be making bosses with big flashy mechanics, and sure, they're difficult, but maybe they're not particularly intuitive and they're just complex for the sake of complexity, and I don't think that would be a great way to design things. But I can see Blizzard falling into that trap. And then in terms of logistical difficulty, well, this is where we have the more harder topic to ponder, really. Because if you want to make the game more hardcore in terms of it takes more time to get through your raids, and it takes more time to gear, and that kind of thing, then sure, I think it would lead to a more rewarding raiding experience for those who choose to partake, but overall, I think you would definitely see a decline in the raiding population. That could be a problem. I suppose they could probably get around that by having flexible difficulty, which will be named normal in Warlords being the kind of regular thing, and then just sort of segmenting off heroic and mythic for the ultra hardcore. But I don't think they do that. But it's a very interesting question. How hardcore, how much time should be needed? So I think that the best place to start when we're sort of thinking about this question is where we currently are in the game. And I think that the Timeless Isle gear actually is not a very good thing for the game. I get why they've done it, and it makes a lot of sense in combination with the level 90 boost. Cynical as that may sound, it does. I think that the 496 Timeless Isle gear has basically nullified the need, at least, for more gear from Throne of Thunder. It's nullified the need for Throne of Thunder LFR gear in a way, because okay, that stuff's 502, but 502, 496, not a great difference. The 496 will get you by, though of course people will still obviously want to get the better itemized raid sets than the often terribly itemized Timeless Isle stuff. But honestly, once people hit the required item level for Siege of Orgrimmar, they're in there, not Throne of Thunder. That's a bit of an issue, the way that the Timeless Isle gear sort of skips that out. But I'm okay with 496s being dropped. I think the biggest problem is A, the frequency, and B, just the way that gear works. I'm okay with it being a little bit more like the Corcoran stuff from patch 5.3, where you can get like one piece on your character per week. Okay, maybe make it 2 pieces per week, but something like that. That it just sort of fills in other spots that for maybe drops in Throne of Thunder LFR, Throne of Thunder normal or something like that you haven't got. I think that would be a great way to do it. So yeah, 496s are okay. They're just currently dropped too much, and that's where we currently are in the game. Now, I'd just like you to imagine for a second that the Throne of Thunder actually had flexible mode integrated into it. So it was flex as well. And then that the Timeless Isle would really only give you 2 496 pieces per character. That would change the landscape of things completely. What it would mean is that one of the more optimal ways of gearing up quick would be to go back into flexible Throne of Thunder. If you were just a guild casually doing your flexes, there would be a more compelling, viable reason to go back into flex TOT. I think that would be good for the longevity of the game and the sort of breadth of content that people have access to. So that would be a pretty cool thing in my opinion, and in Warlords of Draenor, I think that might actually happen. Because, of course, every raid tier is going to have normal, heroic, and mythic, so your equivalent of, you know, flex, normal, and heroic that we have today. Because of that, I think that with the way the item levels will work out, with the way all those things will be, hopefully Blizzard balances them right anyway, there should still be a reason to go back into the previous tiers flex/normal mode, especially if it receives a slight nerf. I think those slight nerfs are sometimes annoying, but they're often okay at the very end of the tier, just to say, hey, look, this tier is now finished, but we still want it to be a viable method of loot acquisition, so we've made it a little bit easier, and you can go in there and gear up your alls, gear up your things nice and quick. I think that that would be a really nice way of balancing out the logistical difficulty and how hardcore the game is. I don't know, is that logistical difficulty? I suppose it's just adding more paths for getting gear, and I just think it would be a better balance that is in some ways a little bit more reminiscent of, I think, some of the good points from the Vanilla and Burning Crusade things. So there's that, if you've managed to... I think that was pretty coherent, hopefully. So there's that. Now in terms of fight difficulty, how hard should fights be? Well, I think they're going in a very interesting direction at the minute. I like where they are currently. I think that the Siege of Orgrimmar fights were very much... they were high quality. I think all their mechanics worked quite well. They were all very visceral and honestly a boatload of fun. I think even... say, Shav Pride, that was one of my... I loved that fight. I loved Nurishen. Fallen Protectors, yeah, it was pretty good. It was a pretty good council fight. All in all, though, I just enjoyed the mechanics of Siege of Orgrimmar, but I'm just a little bit worried that they might step over the bounds too much. And I think that if they step over the bounds of difficulty and complexity too much, then it could be okay, provided we have 1 or 2 slightly easier bosses. I don't want to say easier, but if you go back to ICC... you started off with Bone Storm and Lord Myrogar. It was a pretty easy fight, but I think it was very visceral and it was fun, so that was definitely something in its favor. Then you move on to your woman, the cultist person, and then you have the loot ship. I think the loot ship was a great little invention, because what loot ship did is it was a break in pace. It was different. It was a change. And I think that break of pace is maybe something that the Siege of Orgrimmar misses out in a little bit of a way. And then also you've got, say, Deathbringer or whatever. Then you move on, you've got Rotface and whatever the other one's called. One of those being more of a patchworky style fight. I think it would be okay if you had some fights which were more complex than some of the ones now, though not Paragons of the Claxi, because no. But some fights that were more complex, but then some that were less complex, so there's a bit more variation there, so that in terms of the mental capacity that's required to just, you know, raid, and the fight-to-fight sort of brain power that's required, there's more of a variation there, and I think that variation in terms of what the raid would demand from you could actually be quite compelling to players, and it might be a better design moving forward than what we currently have. So yes, there's that. And then finally, just the idea of how independent should raid tiers be. I did ask that question, and I think I pretty much answered it when I talked about logistics. Basically, I'd like a little bit more bleed over than we have right now, but overall, I don't really want it to return to the days of the Burning Crusade, or perhaps, well, more so, Vanilla. though I'm very hopeful that in Draenor, with every single raid having a flexible difficulty, that we might see a little bit more of a return to that. Also, I just love it if Blizzard would drop slightly less gear overall, but then have the gear more spread out in various other, like, different places in raids, so that it was still like a viable option to just, hey, go back, you know, do some of the old LFR, not LFR, the old flex maybe, to fill out a piece. I'm not particularly sure how it all work out, but I think this idea of going back to the previous raid's flex may end up panning out. We just need to know more. They are probably going to cover their plans for Warlords of Draenor raids in the third part of the dev water cooler blog that Watcher's currently working on. So that's him done with part 1, and honestly the topics I've covered in this video probably will sort of cover what he will talk about in part 2, but part 3 should be very interesting. I can't wait to see what he has to say. Anyway, that was just me kind of giving some of my raw thoughts. Often in these videos I kind of have an ultra detailed list of bullet points. This time it was a little bit less detailed, but I think it kind of turned out in more of a just a nice conversational way, which is pretty cool. So yes, do let me know what you think about all these various topics. What do you think they're going to do for Warlords of Draenor? Or more importantly, do you think they might go in the right direction or the wrong direction? And what do you think that right or wrong direction may be? Anyway, that's the questions for you, but that's really it for the video. Thank you very much for watching. Please hit that like button if you made it this far, because that'd be awesome. And I will see you next time.